Welcome to another exciting edition of Blogging Heads. I am one of your two kind hosts, Ezra Klein at the Washington Post.
And I'm Ramesh Ponnuru with National Review and occasionally also with the Washington Post Online.
How you doing, Ramesh?
Great. How are you?
I'm all right. So let's talk about your people here for a second. Tell me a little bit about GOP 2012. I know Sarah Palin has a book coming out, and Tim Pawlenty has some dude in a back room writing zingers for him. It seems like it's heating up a little bit.
Yeah, it is. I'd say the biggest news in the presidential sweepstakes on the Republican side over the last 2 weeks was the debut of Pawlenty's PAC, and he's got some heavy hitters who have affiliated with him. I just did a story for National Review on Romney. And I would say at this point that Romney is to the extent there is one, is the front runner for 2012. I mean, keeping in mind that at this point in the last cycle, there had probably been a good argument as to whether Bill Frist or George Allen was the front runner. And of course,
George Allen.
Yeah, right. Neither of them was even in public life by the time the campaign rolled around. What I think is interesting, I think the Romney story is pretty interesting, actually, because I think that he's in such a different strategic situation than he was last time around, that you're going to see a different style of campaign from him, where he is not. I think it makes less sense for him this time to run as sort of the conservative movement candidate, and more sense to run as the establishment candidate in the party. I think you're seeing some moves in that direction on his part, and the interesting thing will be whether he can do that without reviving the charge against him that he is, that he's a phony.
I mean, I sort of, on some level, like Romney. I like the reforms he did in Mass on healthcare. I think that he's an interesting guy, clearly a bright guy. It seems to me, from the outside of all this, as a neutral observer, that he is fatally dogged by the perception that he has less core than a donut.
Right.
And the guy just has nothing to him. And over time, much to my displeasure, because I like the idea of, there being a serious sort of technocrat in the Republican Party who's really trying to think this stuff through, I came to pretty much agree with that he really just would do or say absolutely anything, no matter what it was, to get elected. And I do sort of wonder, given that he did that to all sides, to conservatives, to moderates, to liberals, if he really has any chance to ever be trusted by anybody ever again.
Well, a lot of it was...
Seems a little bit dead man walking to me.
Right. A lot of it was the flip-flops between when he ran for governor in 2002 in Massachusetts and when he started running for president, where he moved right on a lot of issues, most visibly abortion, but also a lot of others. And I think... Immigration,
taxes,
right,
healthcare.
Guns. Campaign finance. You can make
it's hard to pick the issue on which he did it.
Right, exactly. Well, I think
his stance on parks didn't appear to change,
as far as we know. I think that he's going to have something going for him in 2012 in that respect. One is presumably he keeps these positions that he took in for the 2008 campaign, so he'll bend with them longer. The flip-flop will be further ago in time. That will reassure the people that he needs to reassure in the Republican Party. And, things he can write some things off as ancient history. The second thing is, I think part of what graded and made him seem an inauthentic candidate wasn't so much the particular positions he took, but a couple of other things he did. Number one, sort of advertising his conservatism and trashing other people's lack of conservatism when, these were positions that he had just adopted, I think came across.
Can I just say my favorite one of those?
Yeah, sure.
My favorite one of those was when he began bragging that he was an NRA lifetime member, and that turned out to be the name of a particular membership he had bought like 2 months before. Right.
I
thought that was absolutely golden.
I'm familiar with what that means, so when it came up, it didn't even occur to me that he was implying something that wasn't true. But yeah, now that you mention it, I can totally see that.
Well, maybe it just shows my unfamiliarity with the NRA, but
you mentioned in passing something else which is a problem for him, and it's separate from all the questions of authenticity and flip-flopping. The healthcare thing Jerry Seib wrote a piece in the Journal maybe a couple months ago saying, Romney's having a great 2009, everything's breaking his way, all these other people are engulfed in scandals, and here's the straight-laced Mormon. And one of his things that was supposedly going Romney's way was the prominence of health care. And I completely disagree. This issue is really bad news for Romney. And part of in a nutshell, it's the fact that you like what he did in Massachusetts better than I do is going to be a problem for him.
And of course, Romney, you can imagine a world, right, where Romney decided to play that up, right, to sort of run as a Republican Bill Clinton, to say, this party needs to get a bit more serious, jettison some of the old orthodoxies. I'm a governor, I know how to get things done, I've compromised with the Democratic legislature, which one way or another he'll probably be having to do, either at least one chamber. But he doesn't do that, right, and this gets to something I think that's worth talking about with him, which is true a little bit for John Kerry, too. There are certain politicians who are good at flip-flopping, who are good at taking the opposite position and making it seem like there never was another. Right. They never had another position, or if they did, that it's perfectly understandable. I mean, look, this is politics. What are you, an idiot? But Romney isn't. He comes across very straining when he does it. I mean, it's always a little bit sad to see. I think it, in some ways, is sort of almost like a lack of social grace, actually, on his part. But he has a real tough time. So on healthcare being a good example, right, it isn't simply that he did something Republicans now decided they don't like. And it isn't simply that he decided to reverse course on whether or not that was a good idea. But that the way he's done it has been to pretend he's not attacking his own idea and make very sort of technocratic, hair splitting between the two options, and it isn't convincing to anybody, and it has, I think, contributed to just one more problem for Romney, which is that at the beginning of one of the reasons he seemed powerful in 2008 was that he had a lot of elite support, and he doesn't have any elite support anymore, as far as I can tell. That folks who policy folks, op-ed folks, media people tend to sour on him as simply just a phony, somebody who you couldn't trust him to continue on the thing you were saying you liked him for.
Well,
as such, it wasn't a very safe thing to say, oh, Mitt Romney did a good job on this.
Well, I think you're underestimating the extent of elite support that he has. I would say, for example, if you're talking sort of conservative policy and political elites, for example, I'd say there's significantly more support for him than there is for Sarah Palin. But who are his actual competitors, right? If you're talking Newt Gingrich, and Tim Pawlenty,
I thought it was Pawlenty, right? Everybody keeps telling me that Pawlenty is the guy to watch.
Pawlenty is a guy to watch, but I would say that that they are pretty evenly matched, if Romney is not ahead of Pawlenty. One thing to think about is, if you think about the Republican Party, it was oft described sort of monarchical tendencies. The Republican Party has won with a guy who never ran for president before once in the last 50 years. Right? George W. Bush is the only one in the last 50 years who succeeds at getting the presidency on his first try. And it's very hard. Republicans do tend to prefer somebody who's actually, been around the track a little bit. And I think that is another advantage that Mitt has.
Let me ask you one more question on
Sure.
this. Do you have a draft pick here? Do you have, not of the current field, right, but is there somebody you or you think other Republicans just sort of wish would get off the fence? If there are reasons maybe you think you shouldn't do it, but just like sort of a lot of Democrats decided Barack Obama, though pretty much a novice at this game, was sort of such a talent that you'd like to see him in there. Is there anybody you think should just say, screw it, this is a moment, everything's fractured,
right.
We need change?
Well, I
business leader, someone?
I like Mitch Daniels. He's getting increasingly sort of Sherman-esque in his statements about not running for president, but I do think, I suppose that, his running would be a bet that by 2012 people are ready for the un-Obama, the guy who's as short and pale and uncharismatic as you can possibly be. But I think he's been a successful governor, that there's a certain that he sort of radiates competence, which is still something that Republicans after the tail end of the Bush years have got a deficit on. Other than that, the people talk about as dark horses like Newt Gingrich. I think Newt is.
I refuse to entertain possibilities of Newt Gingrich. I am a young guy, Ramesh. I have not been doing this very long. But still, in the period when I've been doing this, I have gone through 2 separate presidential elections in which people kept saying Newt Gingrich was about to run.
Right.
And I'm just not going to play this game.
Well, and if he does run, the high point of his campaign will be the day he announces. And then the following days, people will remember why he got to an 18% national approval rating when he was Speaker of the House.
Yeah, I don't think it's a good idea. And I was trying to think of this question too. I mean, I sort of wonder if there are any sort of, big business leaders out there. You sort of, it does feel like a moment potentially that, look, you could see something happen with Obama. You see a real deterioration there. But as it is, it seems to me that any sort of natural politician there is going to just be decimated. Well, and given the fact that they don't even have any really strong ones, it seems to me like real trouble. But you could think of somebody who could break the race open a little bit. But I don't know who that would be. And
well, I mean, the other interesting question, if we could just move it outward a little bit, is there a kind of conservative moment that's peaking too soon right now? I mean, if you're a Republican, it's great to be up in a reasonably solid way in Virginia and in a much less solid way in New Jersey, but, presumably you'd much rather be up in this time next year. If the economy improves, does a lot of what seemed to be a conservative revival turn out to be just an artifact of a rising unemployment rate?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of my sense. I mean, I guess I wouldn't even go so far as to say that, and this is probably my perspective, which is different than yours, but that we're even really seeing conservative revival. I mean, I think that if you reran the McCain-Obama election today, Obama would win by a larger margin, not a smaller one. That I think that, obviously, I think Virginia is trending to where it sort of more naturally is, and I think New Jersey is about Corzine. I think Republicans would do somewhat better in congressional elections this year than they have in recent years if we held it tomorrow. But in part, that seems to me to be a trending back towards the mean, that Democrats are always going to lose that majority. I mean, if it happens this year, or 2010 rather, or 2012 or 2014, hard to say, but they're going to sacrifice that at some point. So
sacrifice their majority in the Congress, or sacrifice their...
Oh yeah, they're going to lose that at some point.
Huh. There's no permanent Democratic majority.
I'm not a believer in that sort of thing. And I guess, I guess that is an artifact of the historical moment I grew up in, right? Because before 94, Democrats had Congress, had the House for 40 years.
Right.
So there is some evidence that can happen, but my sense is we're a lot closer now, and these things are a lot more competitive. And without the Dixiecrat alliance, it swings back and forth, and I think that isn't about parties, and it's not about conservative or liberal moments so much as it is about sort of dysfunctions in the government, polarization, natural tendencies towards scandal and exhaustion, things of that nature.
Well, I think it is hard to contest, I think, the idea that the Virginia race would look very different if McCain had won the presidency, or if it was taking place last year. I mean, I do think a lot of that has to do with Obama being in the White House, and you see the candidates position themselves. But if you're talking about sort of a reversion to trend, I think that case is going to be easier to make for Virginia than it is for New Jersey. I mean,
but I think, as I said, New Jersey's about Corzine fundamentally.
Right. So it's. Yeah, well, look, you could say Deeds is just a weak candidate in Virginia. I just think...
Yeah, but I'm sort of not saying that. I think actually Virginia's pretty competitive. I think you're probably right that there's national issues going on where last year Virginia was, hated Bush, and this year, I'm not sure, I don't know what Obama's, approval rating is in Virginia, but I think that there is less of an exhaustion with the Republican Party, so, McConnell's doing better than he otherwise would, or than he would have in 08. But I think New Jersey is a little bit weirder.
Obama's approval among likely voters in Virginia is lower than his approval in Virginia as a whole. I mean, there is an enthusiasm gap right now, which again is the sort of thing that you wonder, how much can that sort of can that kind of enthusiasm gap be sustained?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a very interesting question, and particularly in the midterms, right, with seniors and whites versus non-whites. I mean, what you see in midterm elections is that the demographics that vote Republican vote more. In presidential elections, it is not that way. But I think that doesn't give us a terrible segue into healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely.
The decisive midterm questions here. So, I obviously follow this stuff closely. You do too. What do you think, Ramesh? Where are we?
I think we're at the stage, for months now we've been hearing people say, well, it can't possibly pass because how are they going to finesse the public option thing between the Senate and the House? And you hear people saying, well, I think I read some post, I forget where, the other day saying that passage is now a done deal, a fait accompli. I think it's very much...
John Chait wrote that, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I do read John, so that would be, that must have been it. I think this is very much up for grabs. I think that a lot, and I think one of the things that might end up affecting it is the outcome of these gubernatorial races. Whether or not it should, I think it does sort of affect the atmospherics. I think Democrats will be very much breathing a sigh of relief if they win even one of those governorships. And if they win both of them, then I think that the Democrats are going to be really emboldened on Capitol Hill. Again, whether or not that's sort of an intelligent way to react to those elections. What's your take on odds of passage at this moment?
I think very high for something. I mean, I think you're sort of fundamentally misreading the Democrats in this way. The lesson they took out of 1994, and this is pretty universal, I mean, it's true among centrists, among moderates, among blue dogs, is that if this goes down, then there is an amplifying effect that happens in the aftermath of failure.
Yeah.
That it isn't simply seen as, well, they tried, it was worth trying, it didn't quite work out, they fell short by a couple votes. What happens is you get a lot of stories on what went wrong. You get a lot of sort of, news things on liberal overreach. There, tensions break out in the party. The media begins reporting a lot more bad stories about Democrats, about what's going wrong, about the embattled Obama administration. And whatever happened, however bad the failure of healthcare was, that gets a whole lot worse for you. That becomes a real weight around your neck. So whatever happens, I think they get on a fundamentally crassy political level.
Yeah.
They have got to pass something. And the difference between this year and 1994 is that in 94 they had 57 and this year they have 60.
Well,
and those are different numbers.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that Democrats up and down, sort of across the spectrum in Congress believe that interpretation of what happened in 1994 and don't want to repeat it. And that is a big factor that is increasing the odds of passage of something. I may be the only person, there are a couple others who don't believe in that interpretation of 94. And also, even if it was true about 94, I'm not 100% sure it's applicable here because the difference in time is significant, right? I mean, healthcare collapsing just a few months before the midterm elections is, I think, just different from if it were to collapse, it collapsing a year out. I mean, I think there's just time to regroup. There's time to get other stuff passed and so forth. But I also just think that the interpretation of 1994 is incorrect. That you were, that the Democrats, the plan was unpopular before it collapsed, and it was the trying to pass it, not the failing to pass it, that really hurt the Democrats.
Well, I think sort of either way that. Their sense is that if they'd passed something in 1994, at least they would be able to sell something. But I think they think the same thing here, right? I mean, even if you're a blue dog Democrat, even if you are whatever Lincoln or Nelson isn't up, but Lincoln or by, the difference between being flayed for this sort of healthcare reform thing and having a president look like a failure, and on the other side going back to your district and saying, look, because of what I did, no insurer can ever tell you no.
Right.
Because your daughter got sick. Again, it can never happen. It gives you something to say, right? And if you don't pass it, it gives you nothing to say. You just have to explain. So I think that is going to militate towards passage. I think the interesting question at the moment, and look, the Democrats can always screw it up, but the interesting question at the moment is what does passage look like? That I think the relevant negotiation now is between Democrats and Democrats, centrist Democrats and liberal Democrats, and it's about two or three things, right? It's about, on the one hand, the public plan. But to a degree that I don't think is totally appreciated, it's about revenues. I mean, you have, 130 Democrats in the House signed a letter to Nancy Pelosi saying they don't want the excise tax that the Senate put in. And so you're going to so you do have two pretty different visions of how do you fund this thing, right? In the House, they tax high-income Americans, right? They tax surtax on people above $1 million in income a year, I think it was, or 500,000, depending on which incarnation you're talking about. In the Senate, they have something that essentially essentially taxes high benefit
right.
plans, large benefit plans. That hurts a lot of union members. It hurts some older Americans. It does different things. You can lift some of that. You can make it a little bit more equitable in that way, but then you lose some of the money from it. So you are going to need some sort of big compromise between those two sides, and I think there are compromises out there. You do a somewhat smaller excise tax, and you do the itemized deduction thing on charities, but that's going to be a hard one for them to negotiate. Where, in some ways, I almost think that the public plan, you can see what a couple different compromises that will look like easier than you can see the revenue compromises.
Right. Well, and then you can also, I think, see compromises on the size of the subsidy.
I think you are going to have more trouble compromising on the size of the subsidy than you think.
Just because it creates the revenue hole. If you.
Well, a couple things, right? The liberals really will fight for the subsidy. And then with the individual mandate, you can't have something that isn't a sufficient subsidy, or it's going to be a terrible plan. So you're not going to be able to move that down very much. And in fact, I think you're going to have to move it up a little bit.
Yeah.
And the question is where you're going to get extra revenues from if you don't want to put anything on the deficit, and you can't. So that, I think, is going to make it really a sort of a revenue-focused conversation. I think they need to get to about $900 billion. The plan Bacchus brought out was around, what was it? It was $757 billion, something like that. So they're going to need to get to $900 billion. That's the number the Senate appears to have decided it can handle. Potentially could go up a little bit in conference committee or down a bit, but we'd have to see on that. And it'll be interesting to see how they get there. But that, I think, is a real thing right now. It's going to be this negotiation between House liberals who don't want to get rolled. I mean, literally, as at this point, not merely a matter of policy, but as a matter of politics, they do not want to get rolled by 4 centrist Democratic senators. They feel that is just brutally unfair and bad policy and bad for them in their districts. And the question of how you bridge that gap, I mean, the question of whether or not you end up with something like what the Senate Finance Committee released, or what the Help Committee released, or what the House released, is, that's going to be pretty hard. I don't envy Harry Reid his next couple of months.
Well, especially when you consider that the polling for Harry Reid in Nevada is not looking particularly good.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, too. I think my sense of Reid is that he's actually just sort of said screw it. That you've not seen, I mean, he's been talking up the public plan. Yeah, I get the feeling he's sort of said to himself, I'm going to be a leader, and then I'm going to try to run my Senate race. And, if he goes down, he goes down, I guess. I was also surprised the Democrats gave him the nod after Daschle, because I thought the lesson of Daschle, in part, was you don't have Senate majority leaders from
insecure states.
Yeah, but that was not what they learned. So.
Yeah, well, because it does seem to be repeating itself, right, to some extent, that having this sort of higher national profile has hurt him in his state.
Well, maybe it'd be hurting anyway. I mean, it's a little bit hard to say.
Yeah, I suppose that's right. Do you see any scenario, you've talked about sort of the problems that folks in the House have, who don't want to be rolled. Can you see a significant number of liberals in the House not voting for a health care bill because it doesn't have a public option, like enough to make a difference?
Look, there are a lot of letters out there, and there are a lot of pledges that they will do that. If you go through conference committee, and these folks get really convinced that you simply cannot get it to the Senate, you just cannot, if you don't have some sort of public option trigger as opposed to a public option or something. Or maybe Tom Carper's compromise where states could create their own public option, but something less than what liberals wanted.
Yeah.
Do I think in that scenario they will literally kill health care reform? I don't.
Yeah, I find that really hard to believe that they would do that.
And, you have seen a lot of sort of political positioning on this and fighting and really doubling down on this question, but I don't know how far you can double down on it because there is an essential characterological difference here, right? Like Ben Nelson will literally sleep just fine at night if this doesn't happen.
Right.
And people in the Liberal caucus won't. I mean, there's a difference between why these people are in public service, and I think that matters at the end of the day. So I think that is going to be hard, but they are going to need something. I mean, they're going to be able to go back and say, we got something here. We did not get rolled. I mean, if we hadn't been there, then X would have happened, and instead we're at Y. So, I mean, how you finesse it is not, I think, going to be easy, but it is going to have to take them into account as a serious block of power here.
Yeah, I think. I mean, look, if they've got a negotiating position right now, but I've just got to think that at the end of the day, the folks, the Democrats on the other side of this debate, see what we both see, that they're not going to vote against something.
And I think it'll also go a little bit both ways. I mean, I think that some of the Senate centrists haven't been as intransigent on this as maybe I would have thought.
Well, look, I mean,
we'll have to see it. We've not gone through some of the really rough folks, but Lincoln, I think, was sort of the dog that didn't bark during the hearings, the Senate Finance Committee markup. She's actually, unlike a lot of these folks, unlike Nelson or someone, she's actually facing a really tough re-election battle.
Yeah,
but she was not a problem in the hearings. I mean, she did not, try to grandstand on them or pose an impediment. There was nothing of that nature. Tom Carper was not a problem in the hearings. I mean, so there's a sort of a sense of moving forward. There's more unity at this point than I would have thought. Ben Nelson, for his part, is not making a lot of noise. Now, I think that you are going to see, potentially, and this is where I really worry, there's one sort of round of compromising about to happen, right? This sort of merger that Harry Reid is doing between the help and the finance bills. But then there's a tendency on the floor of the Senate for some of the centrist senators to band together and to say, unless you give us X, Y, and Z,
we're a block.
We won't vote for it.
Yeah.
And that is really going to piss people off.
Yeah.
I mean, that happened on stimulus, and there's a sort of one thing there, and I think people weren't really expecting it. But this is going to be a very delicate compromise.
Yeah, although this time I'd be surprised if Spectre were part of it.
Right, yeah. Oh my God, he is such a worm, isn't he? It's unbelievable. I shouldn't say that. I'm sure he's a very nice guy, but he is.
No, he's not. No. Your first assumption is correct.
The degree to which he has gone from being like the guy in the centrist coalition to the guy like calling Chuck Grassley on the phone to yell at them about death panels or talking about how Democrats totally have 60 votes for the public option. I mean, it is so transparent.
Yeah. Just to go back to something you were saying, I mean, as somebody who thinks that, these bills ought to fail, and it would be really good if they failed, the thing that makes me pessimistic about my preferred scenario happening is, throughout this entire thing, I have heard nothing and I have seen nothing that suggests to me that, say, Kay Hagan in North Carolina or Jim Webb or Mark Warner in Virginia are concerned, are worried about supporting this stuff. I mean, as in all the discussion of who sort of might be gettable either side, nobody brings them up, which suggests to me that the opposition has not reached the point that it would need to reach in order to bring this down.
I would note that Mark Warner and Kay Hagan aren't up for re-election for 5 years.
Well, yeah, that's right. But, a lot of these folks are ultra cautious,
Yeah, that's true.
I take your point, but you're not seeing that. And I guess one other thing, I mean, if I were, advising Republicans on all this stuff, and I suppose to some extent as a writer I do, I would say it's probably going to be important to try to prevent Democrats from voting one way on passage and another way on cloture. That you do not allow them to define a vote on a filibuster as a merely procedural vote, but you define it as if you vote to block a filibuster, you are voting for this bill, and don't let anybody have it both ways. Godspeed
to ye who would run an ad. The word cloture appears in to try to explain that difference. To
no, you don't do that. You don't do that. You just run an ad saying when it counted, he voted for this bill.
Well, you can run that, and then he says voted no on this Washington Post thing, so it just gets into the muck of it. So my hunch, I don't think you are actually going to be able to separate those two out, but the case for doing so seems pretty ironclad to me. One other point I would make on this about Mark Warner or Kay Hagan or whatever, you can go back to 1994 and you can look at Clinton's bill and you can say that was a big goddamn bill. That was a really big goddamn bill. Everybody's insurance would have changed. The government would have had a hand in everything. I mean, it all would have been these new markets they set up. This just isn't, man. I mean, this looks like nothing so much as the moderate Republican alternative in 1994, the mainstream coalition thing that Lincoln Chafee and some others brought up. I mean, this looks like, what Bob Dole and Howard Baker just signed on to. This looks like a moderate Republican bill. I mean, to say the centrist is to almost give it too much. I don't mean that in a bad way. They're decent moderate Republican things. Say what?
You're talking about the Baucus bill, right? Because those bills didn't have public options in them.
I am talking about the Baucus bill.
Yeah.
But that is what I'm talking about. And honestly, if you want my prediction, what we're going to end up with is going to look a lot more like the Baucus bill than the House bill.
Yeah, I suspect that's right.
And I mean, it really would be. One of the pities about all this, and I'll make this point too, is that there are. If this had if the Baucus bill, right? Okay, no public option. Can't have public option. Everybody hates public option on the right. If the Baucus bill had been recast as sort of people could handle that, and you could actually get a couple votes if you did this or that, right? Maybe if you went after the employer tax deduction and moved it more towards sort of the tax treatment that McCain saw, something like that. I mean, I think there would have been places in this bill where you could have seen, real improvements from true cooperation, but instead, I mean, there's been a tendency to recast absolutely everything as liberal and unacceptable. I mean, you do not see Republicans coming to the Baucus bill and saying, that looks pretty good. We said this was going to increase the deficit. That does the opposite. It actually does bring it down. That really is a private market solution to healthcare. That really is, and I'm not saying every Republican, but 8, 10, 6. Couple moderates, people who were more reachable on this, and it seems impossible to do anything like that now. But it shouldn't distract from the point that this is fundamentally a bill that over time a lot of Republicans have proposed variants of it, and close variants. I mean, even if you look at the bill by Price in the House, it's different than this bill, but if you squint, it ain't that different. I mean, actually, it's sort of more radical in certain ways, but it's exchanges and no public option and.
All right. Well, the Democrats should just adopt the Price bill. We'll have bipartisan comedy, and things can pass quickly, and everyone will be happy.
Yeah, but I think you're dodging my point here a bit, Ramesh.
Well, no, look, I mean,
it's not. Democrats actually have the majority here, but
right.
they're building a bill. I think that if you look at this in the scope of discussions we've been having on this issue for 10, 15, 20 years now, this just isn't a bill that when people sort of have sat down and discussed this outside of the heat of town halls and this and that, they said, this would be totally unacceptable to me. This was the thing they always said, this would be actually pretty acceptable to me. If you looked at what Enzi and Grassley said 4 months ago, this is what they were talking about. Now, you could make an argument, right, that as the bill goes through the congressional process, it will get more liberal, and moderate Republicans can't trust them. I think that's a fair argument. I'll grant the potency of that. But there just hasn't been there has not been any group of Republicans that I have seen who came forward and said, if you put these things in your bill, just put these things in there, we think we can be part of this. We think this is what the compromise could look like. There just hasn't been anything like that.
Yeah. No, I mean, well, because, look, okay, let's break a couple things. I mean, let's make a distinction, right, between sort of the conservative bulk of the Republican Party and the moderates. It is certainly the case that something like what you're describing could have happened in 1993, 1994. You could have had, I think, as many as 10 Republican senators at that time for some sort of compromise type legislation. Let's, like Clinton, Cooper, Chafee in 1993, 94. A lot of those guys just aren't there anymore. But I think,
that's true.
But I think that that wing of the party has shrunk. But the bulk of the party would not have signed on to that just because it has a fundamentally different vision. I mean, I think you're sort of underestimating the differences. It is true. There are things, right? I mean, there's even sort of hardcore conservatives are not sort of fundamentally opposed to the idea of an exchange, for example, right? They have a different concept of what it should be like, but a lot of that can look pretty detailed. But I mean, for example, the individual mandate, you're sure you can have Republicans who are for that. But there was no, I think, possible universe in which the bulk of Republicans were going to sign on to that idea.
No, that I agree with. But you really did. I mean, Grassley talked up an individual mandate.
Right.
Bennett talked up an individual mandate. And if you look at the difference between, I mean, Bennett is in some ways an interesting example here, right? Because I know you're not a big Wyden Bennett fan, but just use him. He's a conservative of some sort or a Republican of some sort, God knows. And I think his plan is better than the one we're looking at here, by a mile, frankly. But there's nothing in the principles of his plan that should make him necessarily opposed to this plan, except that this plan is associated with Barack Obama and he's up for re-election, I mean, he's for an individual mandate.
Yeah.
And if he just said, look, I'll give you my vote if you don't have a public option, that just probably wouldn't be a public option. If him and 3 others said that, you would probably see that deal get cut.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
And you just have, I mean, I just think it's interesting. I mean, I'm not necessarily even confused by it. I'm not saying Democrats could cross the aisle on something like this either. But I just think it really is. Because these things end up looking so partisan, I think that because of polarization, the way the votes end up breaking out, I think there's a tendency to overestimate the degree to which they represent pure ideologies of one sort or another. I mean, if you to just say to say a more straight word on this, this is the bill they built in the Gang of Six process with very few alterations from my reporting on it, and it's a bill that Enzi and Grassley and Snow were pretty comfortable with, but ended up not being able to, in Grassley and Enzi's case, support. But it wasn't because Chuck Grassley came out and said, I cannot handle your blah, blah, blah.
Right.
There wasn't a specific thing. He just couldn't. And, look, he knows his political situation better than I know it, but he just couldn't. And, but the bill isn't. The bill's probably going to pass with 60 Democrats and maybe one Republican, but it isn't that bill in a weird way. That's just our politics now. And I think it's sort of a shame. I think there are ways it could have been a better bill if you had some more, if the Democrats who want to do things like cap the employer tax deduction could have been able to get some cover on that, say.
I was worried, again, speaking of somebody who doesn't like these bills, doesn't want them to pass, I was worried that the Democrats would do some sort of, some sort of federal medical malpractice thing, which I'm also against, by the way, on policy grounds. That if that had happened, I think it would have been a lot easier for people like Bennett to cross over. That may have also been a missed opportunity.
I just don't agree. I don't agree with that in this way. This is what I was saying about a list of demands. That malpracticing was carved out for a deal. They were just waiting for somebody to offer them that deal, right? They didn't want to do it. I mean, I think they began to believe that you can't put this in the bill and then expect somebody to come and vote for it in order to thank you for it. But I mean, there's just no doubt. There is literally no doubt in my mind. I've talked to a lot of people on this particular score that if 3 Republicans, I'm not saying 15, 3, had come to them and said, you have our votes if you don't go with a hard public option.
Right.
And if you give us a pretty serious medical malpractice reform, we'll be on board for you. Max Baucus would have cut that deal in 2 seconds. 2 seconds.
Yeah.
It took them nothing. I mean, they would have been happy to do it. One thing about malpractice reform is it's a big deal to a particular Democratic constituency. It is not a big deal to Democrats.
Right.
I mean, they would throw that overboard in 2 minutes. I'm one of the people who would throw that overboard in 2 minutes.
Right,
so
which is sort of one of the reasons why I didn't... but by the same token, that's one of the reasons I was sort of surprised that it didn't happen. And yeah, you can blame these guys for not sort of taking whatever...
But throw it overboard for what?
For not...
Like, I wouldn't throw it overboard for nothing.
Right, no,
You'd have to give me a vote.
I understand that, yeah. So I suppose the question then would be, I mean, in your reporting, was there any evidence that anybody had sort of, behind closed doors come to them with that kind of offer and asked,
Snow did come out and she said, here's my list of 27 things or whatever it was. I mean, she had a very specific series from what I could tell. But she's the only one. At no other point was there ever anyone who came to him and said, specifically, if you do this, I will do this. I mean, if you actually go back, the people who did speak in these terms sometimes were Enzi and Grassley because they were thinking about that.
Right.
And if you go back to their original comments on that, they were met.
Yeah.
And the terms were sort of the things that are consensus oriented in healthcare, exchanges.
Yeah.
Can increase the deficit. But there was never, there was nothing like that from McCain or Graham or anything. I cannot find. It's possible something happened that I don't know about. I cannot find anywhere in my reporting.
Well, of course, Grassley...
If anybody wants to come over and show me wrong, I'll take it. Where somebody came out the checklist and said, here are 5, reasonable things. If you do these, we're here.
And Grassley is somebody else who's facing potential trouble on the right.
Primary challenge, up for election in 2010. So, anyway. It's one of the interesting stories about this year.
Yeah. So to go back to the sort of beginning of the discussion, your bottom line, if they don't pass it, you think that is just, it's a huge calamity. Not just, obviously you think it's a tragedy in policy terms, but you think it's a political disaster as well.
I think it probably is, not in the sense that people are going to be very angry about the healthcare bill, but that it has a sort of a momentum effect. But I would say as a general point that I don't think I'm a very good election prognosticator.
Right.
I don't follow the polls very closely. I don't look at individual districts that closely, and so my senses on this are pretty vague and unformed. But I do think that Democrats are in a better position, being able to both go to their base, but also the voters, and say we have succeeded on a really sort of historic scale here, than going to them and saying, we have absolutely failed and our vision was rejected. Because nobody's going to be particularly interested in the idea that the filibuster is part of what rejected the vision, and Ben Nelson is a jerk.
Well, yeah, well, clearly it's the worst thing in both worlds. If you've got a Democrat, you've got the worst of both worlds if you're a red state, a red district Democrat who votes for the thing and it fails. Or voted for it at various stages of the process and it fails. I suppose the better if you're Blanche Lincoln in a way, you're better off if it passes. Assuming that your assumption and the Democratic assumption is correct, that passage is good for the party, you're better off if it passes without your vote, or if it passes, sort of with you being able to cast mixed votes on its passage.
Yeah, I think you'll probably see that. I think Blanche Lincoln's going to get cut loose a couple times here if she wants to be. But I will say that I thought she was going to be a big problem, just looking at poll numbers. Mm-hmm. And people I've talked to just don't say she is. Now, that could always prove wrong. People could be lying to me, whatever. But her behavior hasn't suggested anything different. I think on some fundamental level, she might think it's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you never rule out the possibility that people sort of, do what they think is right. Sometimes inconveniently for their allies, but I think that's I remember you were probably 10 when when the impeachment votes were happening, and people were surprised about why.
I was 14.
Okay, all right. People were surprised with the moderate Republicans. Genuinely moderate Republicans in the House who voted for this, and I was at a Brookings lunch, and I was, being put on this bus, explain this, and I think, I think actually sort of a lot of them have sort of come to believe this is the right vote to cast. And they know it endangers them, but they still think it's the right vote to cast. Not all of them, of course, but, people do get involved in politics for a range of reasons, and some of them do include, wanting to do, what they think is the right thing.
Well, that is, it is. I'll say one other thing on this. People get very involved in sort of the cynicism of people like Ben Nelson or Nabai, or on the right in our own specter, or used to be on the right in our own specter. But one thing about all these questions, right, is that you wouldn't be having this discussion if you didn't have 45 votes that were totally certain, or 50 votes that were totally certain. So most people aren't pulling anything, right? They've said, I support healthcare reform. They've never wavered in that, and they just do their thing, and it's just the people who seem very cynical, the people who are sort of leveraging for maximum impact in the final months of a discussion, end up getting a lot of press coverage, and end up sort of defining the way the Senate works in the minds of people, even as
because that's where
by the very nature of it being three people the press is talking to at the end of the day, that isn't how the Senate works.
Yeah.
But these three people right there in the sweet spot.
Yeah. You've mentioned Ben Nelson a few times here, and I gather from what you're saying that you're suggesting that he's sort of just a cynical operator. My assumption's always been that he sort of wants to vote as conservatively as he can within his party, and that that sort of is kind of where he is in his actual views. Is that? Do you think that there's something sort of more amoral going on with him?
Oh, I wouldn't. If I'm using Ben Nelson sort of as an example of the archetypal vote who's sort of right there, and he does seem to cut deals that don't make any sense to me. On the one hand, he will, demand that the stimulus be cut by $100 billion for no particular reason. Why $100 billion? Hard to say.
Nice round number.
Whatever. Nice round number, exactly. And on the other hand, want to pay student loan middlemen an extra $14 billion a year ongoing because some of them are in Nebraska. So, I think a lot of his votes don't match up in the way where you would say this is ideological. But whether Ben Nelson in the aggregate is cynical or is conservative or just likes being the deal maker, I don't know. I don't have particular insight into him. He's I think the real problem child for the Democrats right now.
Yeah, no, you don't. You don't want anything really sort of depending on him,
right,
for passage.
But for better or for worse, in some way, it all will. Now he could decide it doesn't, and I will vote for cloture on everything, and then vote how I want to vote. But so far as he decides that he wants it all to depend on him, it will. No doubt about that.
Before because we're both so interested in healthcare, we're probably eating up most of this blogging heads on it. But
we're at 45 here. We may want to just scrap McChrystal, I think.
Okay, but do you how seriously do you take this threat that Bart Stupak has issued in the past that he can bring down the House bill on a rule if he doesn't get a vote on his pro-life amendment to it?
I think that this would require him to have a very long conversation with Louis Slaughter, who runs the Rules Committee.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that he will find himself somewhat mistaken. I don't know, though.
It seems like recent quotes he's been backing down a little bit from that. I mean, he originally was saying, I've got the votes. Now he seems to be saying, well, we won't actually know until we have a vote.
Right. I have no real insight into that. Honestly, I haven't done any reporting on that, and I've not been paying too much attention to what he's arguing there. But my hunch is that the House is sort of run a bit like the Soviet Union. If the Democrats don't want him to do something that's going to put them in a difficult political position, it probably ain't going to get done.
Yeah, that's right. having the House majority really is different from having a Senate majority in that sense. You can sort of just, really with 219, 220 votes, you can impose your will. And in fact, during
you can do what you want. And look, it's not like the days when the Rules Committee is run by a Dixiecrat. Slaughter is there, and she literally makes the rules. So, she's got a liberal majority on that committee. So, I think I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the House, except insofar as negotiation goes with the Senate. But I don't think they're going to have a lot of trouble getting this off the floor. If they could pass cap and trade, which was not a good idea to pass it when they did, but still to pass
why did they do that? That just seems
a plan that nobody thought would work and that nobody actually seemed to want in that scenario. That was a really remarkable display of raw political power on the part of Pelosi. And healthcare, a lot of people actually want, and actually there's political support, and the politics aren't way behind the plan. And so I think that it's hard for me to imagine a really serious stick-up in the House.
Well, on that...
Not impossible, but hard.
Well, should we end it on that, to me, depressing note, or...
Sure. Anytime I can depress you, Ramesh.
All right. Good talking to you, Ezra.
Thank you. A pleasure as always.
Take care.